He bought a flooded silver mine for 9 cents. 2 deaf sisters were living in the dry shaft. The deed was still wet from the clerk's stamp when I drove the first nail. Not because I had a plan. I want to be clear about that. A man in his late 50s with a plan would have bought something useful, a piece of grazing land, a hardware store, maybe a stretch of river bottom where the soil still held water. I bought a flooded silver mine in the Calico Hills for 9 cents because the county assessor laughed at me when I asked what it was worth, and I've never been able to tolerate being laughed at. The assessor's name was Greer. Small man. Had a way of looking over the top of his spectacles that made you feel like a child who'd wandered into a room meant for adults. He spread the county plat map across his desk, big oak desk, too big for him, probably inherited it, and he tapped the parcel with one finger, this little square of crosshatched nothing up in the calicos, and he said, "Mr. Creed, that property hasn't turned a dollar since 1887. The main shaft flooded out in the winter of '91, and nobody's pulled so much as a mule shoe out of it since. County's been carrying it on the rolls as a liability." He looked up over those spectacles. 9 cents, that's what we've assessed it at. 9 cents because 0 would mean we'd have to reclassify the paperwork. Then he smiled, the way a man smiles when he's already decided you're a fool. I put a dime on his desk, told him to keep the change. That was the spring of 1903. I was 57 years old and I had been in rough order. A ranch hand in the Texas Panhandle, a muleskinner on the Colorado freight routes, a failed prospector in 2 separate gold rushes, a timber cutter in Oregon, a part owner of a ferry crossing that washed out in a flood, a surveyor's assistant, and for a brief and stupid period, a traveling whiskey salesman. I had never owned land. I had never owned anything that couldn't fit in a saddlebag or a freight wagon. I had a good horse named Amos, a bedroll, a Winchester that I'd carried since I was 22, and approximately $43 in coin. The 9 cents I'd just spent was not going to break me. What I had not counted on, what no one had mentioned, including the laughing assessor, including the county clerk who stamped the deed, including the 2 men I'd spoken to at the feed store in Calico Junction who'd shrugged and said the old Hennessy mine was played out and full of water. What nobody mentioned was that the mine had a dry shaft. The Hennessy had been dug in 2 stages. The first shaft was the original exploration cut, punched straight down into a hillside from the east face. It went maybe 60 feet, hit a promising seam, and then the owners, some eastern syndicate whose name I never learned, had driven a second shaft, a longer diagonal cut from the north face, chasing the vein. That was the one that flooded. The original shaft, the east face shaft, sat 20 feet higher in elevation and had never taken on water. And in that dry shaft, when I arrived with Amos and my bedroll and my Winchester on a Tuesday morning in April, somebody had been living. I didn't know that yet when I came up the wagon road. The mine property was about 4 acres of rocky hillside, a collapsed outbuilding, 2 rusted ore carts sitting on their sides in the brush, and a porthole of darkness in the east face of the hill that used to be the entry to the first shaft. Someone had framed it with new timber, not long ago either. The wood was still pale. I sat on Amos for a good while and looked at that. Then I tied him to one of the ore carts and walked up to the entry with my hand near the Winchester. Inside the shaft there was a door, a real door on hinges with a leather latch. It had been cut down from something larger. You could see where it had been trimmed, planed off along one edge to fit the shaft width. In front of the door, on a flat piece of stone that jutted from the floor, there was a tin cup, cold coffee in it, ground still wet. I stood there and I thought, well, someone is using my mine. I knocked on the door, which felt strange, knocking on a door set into a hillside, but it was a door and those are the rules. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. I tried the latch. It lifted easy and I eased the door open an inch and said, "Hello, the camp," which is what you say, no answer. I opened it the rest of the way. The shaft ran back about 50 feet before it kinked left toward where the ore seam had petered out. Someone had turned that 50 feet into a home, a real one. There were 2 cots, both made up neat with wool blankets. There was a cook stove, a small one, a shepherd's stove, the kind you can move, with a chimney pipe that disappeared up through a hole in the ceiling of the shaft, which told me there was a ventilation crack or a secondary cut up above that they'd found and used for exhaust. Clever. The stove held coals, still warm. There was a shelf on the rock wall, cut from a plank, holding tins and dry goods and 2 coffee mugs. There was a lantern hung from a spike in the timber framing. There was a small table, 2 chairs. On the table there was a sewing basket, and what looked like a half-finished harness being repaired with an awl and waxed thread. 2 people lived here, 2 people neat as a pin in my mind. I sat down in one of the chairs. I wasn't angry exactly. Mostly I was trying to arrange the information in a way that made sense. I waited about 20 minutes. Then I heard footsteps outside, 2 sets coming up the slope fast, the way people walk when they've seen a strange horse tied to their door and they're deciding whether to run or not. The door opened. 2 women. Sisters, you could tell at a glance, same jaw, same way of holding themselves, same dark eyes that went from my face to the Winchester on my back to my face again in about half a second. The older one was maybe 35. The younger one maybe 28 or 30. Both in work clothes, boots, hats. The older one was carrying a wood axe, handle forward, not threatening, just not putting it down either. I stood up, took my hat off, said, "I'm Walt Creed, I just bought this property." The younger one looked at the older one. The older one looked at me for a long moment. Then she set the axe down against the wall, reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out a small chalkboard, the kind schoolchildren use, and a piece of chalk. She wrote on it and held it toward me. It said, "We are deaf. We can't hear you. You can write or you can talk slow, and we read lips SOME." I read it twice. Then I nodded. I pointed at myself and said, slowly, "Walt Creed." I pointed at the deed that was still sticking out of my coat pocket and mimed the general idea of ownership. Then I pointed around the shaft. Then I spread my hands in a question. The older one took the chalkboard back. Wrote, "Ruth Garza, MY Sister Calla. We been here 14 months. We did not know IT was sold." I thought about that. 14 months was a long time to live in a mine shaft. I thought about that winter up in the Calicos. I'd spent it lower down in the valley, and it had been a hard one. These 2 women had been up here in this shaft in that winter. I pointed at the stove, at the good-built shelf, at the chimney pipe. I gave a slow nod that I hoped said, "You did this, all of this." Ruth watched my face. She nodded once. I took out my own pencil. I'm a man who keeps a pencil, always have, comes from the surveying days, and wrote on the back of a receipt slip I had in my pocket. "Where did you come from?" Ruth wrote, "Bisbee, our father died. We had no money for a room. Calla found this shaft and saw it was dry." I looked at Calla. She was watching my face and Ruth's chalkboard with her arms crossed, not hostile, just careful. She had a cut on her right hand that was healing, and her boots were good boots, but they'd been resoled twice. I wrote, "Do you have anywhere else to go?" Ruth looked at it. Then she looked at me for a long time, the way people look when they're trying to figure out if the question is a threat or something else. Then she wrote, "No." I put my hat back on. I wrote, "All right." "Then stay, I'll figure the rest." Ruth read it. Then she turned to Calla and did something with her hands fast, fluid, like water over rock. I had never seen hand talk before. Calla's face shifted. Not quite a smile. More like a woman who has learned not to trust good news too fast but is filing it away to think about later. Ruth wrote, "WHY." I wrote because I need someone who already knows how to live up here, and because that stove pipe is a better piece of work than anything I could have done. She read it, she looked at the stove pipe. She looked at me, and she wrote in smaller letters than before, "We pull our own weight." I wrote, "I know that, I can already tell." That was how it started. I want to try to say what the Calico Hills were like that spring, because you have to understand the country to understand any of the rest of it. The hills were not beautiful the way people in cities mean when they say beautiful. They were the color of old rust and pale limestone, dry grass flattened by winter and not yet come back, juniper and scrub oak on the north-facing slopes and nothing much else. The wind came off the high desert to the east every afternoon, and it was a dry, personal kind of wind that found the gaps in your collar and the back of your neck and stayed there. The nearest town, Calico Junction, was 11 miles down a road that was really just 2 ruts in the caliche hardpan. In wet weather those ruts ran 6 inches of red mud, and in dry weather they sent up a fine silt that coated everything in your wagon and settled in your lungs and took about 3 days to work out. There was water, that was the thing. There was a spring on the northeast side of the property, a real spring, not just a seep, that came out of the rock at about a gallon a minute and ran into a natural stone basin before it went underground. Ruth had found it. She'd redirected it a little, laid flat stones to guide it, and had a barrel set under the flow. In 14 months, she had turned a flooded, dead mine property into something that could support life. That was not an accident. That was intelligence applied steadily over time. I had $43, I had a horse. I had the Winchester and a Colt that rode on my hip and a good skinning knife. I had no tools, no lumber, no supplies beyond what I'd packed in for a look around. So the first thing I did was go back to Calico Junction and spend most of my money. I bought nails, 2 axes, a crosscut saw, a splitting maul, rope, flour, dried beans, coffee, salt pork, lard, a second lantern, lamp oil, 2 wool blankets, and a box of .44 cartridges. I thought about it and bought a second box. The hills above the property had game on them. I'd seen mule deer sign and what looked like wild turkey tracks in the soft soil near the spring, and I had a feeling we were going to need more than what I could haul in from town. I drove back up in a rented wagon with Amos tied behind. Ruth and Calla were outside when I came up the road. They'd been splitting wood, a pile of juniper lengths from a dead tree they dragged down from the slope. Ruth had the maul, Calla was stacking. They stopped and watched me come up with the loaded wagon. I climbed down and started unloading. Flour, beans, salt pork, I set them out in a row. Ruth came over and looked at the supplies. Then she looked at me. I wrote share not charity. You work, I work, we eat. She looked at it for a long time. I could tell she was calculating something, not the words, she'd understood those, but what they meant, what was being offered, whether it was real. Then she went to the wagon and started unloading. She handed the second box of cartridges to Calla and pointed up the hill with her chin. Calla looked at her, looked at me, and then went inside and came out a minute later with a Winchester of her own, older than mine, a model 1873 that had seen hard use but was clean and oiled. She checked the load and went up the hill. I watched her go. I looked at Ruth. Ruth wrote SHE Hunts, better than me. I nodded. I pointed up the hill after Calla and spread my hands. How far does she go? Ruth wrote, depends, deer, half a mile. Last fall she went 4 miles and came back with a buck. I nodded again. I thought, all right. These women are not helpless. They are not waiting to be rescued. They are doing what they have always done, which is survive, and what they need from me, if they need anything, is not protection in the soft sense. What they need is someone who brings resources they don't have, and works alongside them instead of above them. That is what I tried to be from the first day. It was not always easy. I want to be honest about that. The first 2 weeks were mostly work. There was enough work on that property to keep 3 people busy for a year, and we put in long days at it. The collapsed outbuilding had good timber in it, better than it looked. The walls had come down, but the roof beams were still sound, just needed to be pulled out of the pile and restacked. We got them out, and I built a lean-to off the east face of the hill, a proper one with a floor and walls and a roof that shed rain, to serve as a real cookhouse, because the shepherd's stove inside the shaft had been working too hard, and the ventilation cut in the ceiling wasn't really adequate for a full-time kitchen. Ruth watched everything I did and she had opinions. She communicated them without hesitation. She'd pick up the chalk and write GET the slope angle STEPER, or that rafter needs a notch or wrong nail for that board, and she was right every time. Not showing off, just right. She had built things herself, the shelf, the door, the ventilation arrangement, and she had an eye for what held and what would eventually give. I got my back up about it once in the first week. I'm not proud of that. I was fitting a lintel and she came over and wrote that will spit out in frost, needs a keyed joint. She even drew a little sketch of what she meant. And I looked at it and I thought she's right. And I felt something I didn't much like feeling at 57, which was corrected by someone half my age. So I said something short. I don't even remember what, some dismissal. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she picked up her chalk and wrote, "You want to be right or you want the lintel to last." I stood there for a second. Then I said out loud, even though she couldn't hear it, "Fair point." And I recut the joint the way she'd drawn it. After that we got along better. Not warm yet, but functional, respectful. Calla was different from Ruth. Where Ruth was direct and still, Calla moved. She was rarely sitting down, was always going somewhere or coming back from somewhere, and she communicated in this vivid, rapid hand talk with Ruth that I slowly began to pick up the edges of. I could not follow it. It was too fast and too full, but I started to catch individual signs. A certain gesture for the deer on the hill to the north. Another for the spring. One for me, which Ruth eventually showed me. 2 fingers tapping the chin, then a wave outward. She said it meant something like a man who gives and doesn't count it. I sat with that for a while. Calla brought in a deer on the 5th day, a young doe. She dragged it into camp alone, though it probably weighed as much as she did, and she broke it down with a speed and confidence that told me she'd done it 100 times. I helped her hang it, and she tolerated that, watched my technique for the first cut, and then reached over and adjusted the angle of my knife with 2 fingers on my wrist. Not a word, not a sign, just like this. After that, when we dressed game, we worked together, trading off, and it went twice as fast. Those first 2 weeks I slept in the lean-to I built. I had offered them the lean-to. I figured I could sleep outside. I'd done it 10,000 times, but Ruth wrote, "The shaft is ours and the lean-to is yours. That is fair." And it was, and I did not argue. In the 3rd week, I rode down to Calico Junction for supplies and more news about the mine. I went to the county recorder's office this time instead of the assessor's. The recorder was a woman named Hollies, about 60, with the kind of organized mind that manifests as perfectly labeled file drawers and an exact memory for property descriptions. I asked her what she knew about the Hennessy claim. She pulled a file. She said, the Hennessy silver claim was worked from 1882 to 1891. The Eastern syndicate that owned it, the Consolidated Calico Mining Company, declared insolvency in 1895 after the silver prices crashed. The county took it for back taxes. Everything except the north shaft equipment was removed when they went under. The assay records indicate the main seam was running about 40 ounces of silver per ton when they shut down. Not rich, but not nothing. I said, the main shaft is flooded. She said, yes, was as of the last inspection in 1898. I said, what would it take to drain it? She thought about it. She said, there's a drainage cut on the west side that was started in '90, a horizontal bore meant to let the groundwater out naturally. They never finished it. If it was completed, the shaft would drain by gravity within a season, maybe 2. She looked at the file. The bore is about 120 feet from the portal to where they stopped. You'd need to drive another 60, 70 feet to intersect the shaft below the water level. I said, and then? She said, then you'd have a mine. Whether it's worth working is another question. I said, the seam was still running when they quit. She looked at me with more interest than before. She said, yes, the last assay before they flooded was actually the richest they'd pulled. They believed the seam was widening at depth. She paused. Mr. Creed, are you seriously thinking about working the Hennessy? I said I was turning it over. She pulled another paper from the file and slid it across the desk. It was the original survey plat, hand-drawn, with the existing shafts shown in red ink and the unfinished drainage bore shown in blue. She said, I can't tell you it's worth it, but I can tell you you'd be the first person to take it seriously in 12 years. I looked at the plat for a long time. Then I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. That was the first time I thought the 9 cents might turn into something. I did not tell Ruth and Calla right away. I wanted to think it through first, work out whether it was a real thing or just the prospector's disease talking, which I knew I had in my blood. The prospector's disease is this. You look at a dry hole in the ground and you see a fortune. You have no particular reason to see a fortune. You've been fooled before. But you look at that hole and the blood moves in you and you think, this is the one. I knew men who'd given their entire lives to that feeling and ended up with nothing. I'd given years of my own life to it in the Colorado Rush and the one in Idaho before that. But this was different. This had a survey plat. This had an assay record. This had a specific solvable problem, not a dry hole but a wet one, and a drainage cut already started. I went over the numbers in my head for several days. The drainage bore needed 60 to 70 feet of new work. With a hired drill crew, you could probably do that in 3 to 4 weeks. A drill crew cost money I didn't have. But a drill crew of me with proper tools working steadily might do it in 3 months, maybe 4, and I had 3 months. I had the whole summer. The question was the tools. I had axes and a crosscut saw. For rock work I'd need hand steels, drill bits of various sizes, and a single jack, which is a short-handled hammer. I'd need black powder and fuses for blasting the harder rock. I'd need a way to haul the muck out of the bore as I went. The women had a wheelbarrow they'd built from salvaged wood and a wheel off one of the ore carts. That would work just barely. I could buy hand steels and a single jack in Calico Junction. Black powder I'd need to order. That would run me probably $25, which was more than I had. So I did what I'd done before in tight spots. I went to work for someone else for a few weeks. There was a cattle outfit, the Rafter T, about 8 miles west of the junction. I rode out there and talked to the foreman, man named Bauer, ex-Army with a bad leg from a horse wreck, good eye for men. I told him I needed 30 days of work and asked what he was paying. He said 30 a month plus feed, and I said that due. I said I had a property in the Calicos I'd be going back to when the 30 days were up. He said, the old Hennessy. I said, that's the one. He looked at me the way men look when they think you might be simple. But he gave me a bunk and put me to work the next morning, and I kept my mouth shut and did the work and didn't say anything more about it. I sent Ruth a note with a man who was heading past the Calicos. I wrote it on a piece of brown paper, gone to earn money for tools, back in a month. Watch the spring barrel. She couldn't send a note back, obviously. But the man told me later she'd read it again, and then folded it and put it in her coat pocket. At the Rafter T, I worked cattle, mending fence mostly, and some riding to check the line camps on the South Range. I was 57, and some of the younger hands made a point of looking at me sideways, but I'd been doing this work since before most of them were born, and I did it without complaint and without error, and after about 10 days Bauer stopped watching to see if I was going to fold. I thought about the mine most evenings, and I thought about Ruth and Calla. That's the honest truth, and I'll say it straight. I thought about them. Not in the way that gets complicated. I'm not that kind of man, I don't think, or maybe I am, and I just knew it was wrong and kept a lid on it. I thought about them the way you think about something you've left unfinished. I'd left 2 women alone on a hillside in the Calicos and gone to punch cattle, and I found that bothered me in a way that was new. I'd been alone most of my life. Not entirely. I'd had a wife once, a young wife in the Texas years, a woman named Clara who died of a fever in the 2nd year of our marriage. After Clara, I didn't try again. Easier not to, easier to keep moving. You keep moving and you don't have to sit with the empty of a woman-shaped hole in everything. I did not know, until I'd been at the Rafter T for 2 weeks and counting the days, that I'd developed an attachment to anything. I'd been so long without one. I thought about Ruth's handwriting. She had a particular way of making her capital letters with an extra loop on the vertical strokes. I thought about Calla bringing that deer in alone and the 2-fingered adjustment of my knife angle. I thought about the shelf Ruth had built, the level of it, the care. I thought, don't be a fool. You are 57 years old. You are not a young man in a story. These women don't need you for anything except the supplies you've been bringing. Go do the work, get the tools, finish the drainage bore, and if there's silver, good, and if there isn't, find something else. That is what I told myself. It is not entirely what I felt, but I told myself it anyway, and I worked out the 30 days, and on the last day Bauer paid me $28 and said there was work for me in the fall if I wanted it. I said I'd see how the summer went. I bought the hand steels and the single jack at Holly's brother's hardware in Calico Junction. He ran the hardware store, she ran the records office. That family had a knack for keeping information about property. And I ordered 5 pounds of black powder and a spool of fuse from the mining supply outfit in Bisbee to come by freighter in about 2 weeks. I drove back up to the mine on a Wednesday in late May. They'd been busy. The lean-to I'd built had been extended. Ruth had added a full front wall with a window cut in it, shuttered with a piece of canvas on a frame, and had rerouted the chimney from the shaft stove to share the lean-to's chimney stack, which meant the lean-to was now heated. There was a new wood pile bigger than the old one. Someone had replanted the collapsed ground near the spring with what looked like a kitchen garden, small plots of earth turned and smoothed, some early seedlings already showing. Ruth came out when she heard the wagon. She looked at the tools in the wagon bed, the hand steels, the single jack, the coil of rope. She looked at me. I wrote, found a way to drain the mine. Silver might still be there. She read it, she looked at the tools again. She wrote, show me. So I did. I took her into the drainage bore on the west side. It was a horizontal cut, about 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, already 120 feet deep when the syndicate quit. And I showed her the survey plat by lantern light and explained what needed to happen. She was quiet, standing there in the dark with the lantern turning her face amber, reading the plat and then looking at the wall of rock at the end of the bore. She wrote how long. I wrote 3 months, maybe 4. She wrote, I will help. I wrote, the rock work is hard. You drill and I swing the jack. Calla hauls the muck. She looked at it, then she put up one finger, wait, and went back outside. I could hear the hand talk through the stone, which you couldn't really hear, but I could feel it, this sense of two people coming to an arrangement. She came back a few minutes later and wrote, we both drill. You swing. Calla HAULS and we take turns. I said, wrote, all right. That was the summer of 1903. I want to try to get it down right, because it was, I don't have a word for it exactly. I'll just say it was the best work I ever did. The hand steels are long rods of hardened steel, one end chisel cut for the rock face and the other end flat for the hammer. You set the steel against the rock. The drill man holds it and turns it a quarter turn between blows, and the swing man drives it with the single jack. You drill a pattern of holes, a ring of them around the face, another ring inward, and a cut hole in the center to give the blast somewhere to go, and then you pack the holes with powder, run the fuse, and blast. Then you haul out the muck, the broken rock, and start again. It sounds simple. It is not simple. The holes need to be the right depth and angle, or the blast throws the rock backward instead of out. The powder needs to be packed right. The fuses need to be cut to give you time to get clear. If you rush any of it, at best you waste a charge, at worst you don't walk out. I'd done rock work before, briefly, in the Colorado days. Ruth had not. But she watched me drill the first pattern, 6 holes, ring pattern, cut hole center, and she held the steels without hesitation, turning them cleanly between blows, not flinching when the jack hit close to her hands. After the first blast, she stood in the smoke and looked at the new face, and then she turned and wrote. The 2 outside holes were angled too shallow. We lost rock on the south side. She was right. The south side of the blast had left a shelf of unbroken rock because the outside holes hadn't gone deep enough. I wrote 30 DEGRES STEPER on the outside ring. She wrote, I know. And from the second blast on, she drilled the outside ring at 30 degrees steeper, and she was more consistent than me. We worked 6 days a week, roughly 5 to 6 hours of hard work a day. You can't do more than that in a rock bore. The noise and the dust and the exertion will beat you down, and we advanced the bore at about 2 feet per shift. Some days less if the rock was particularly hard, or we hit a wet seam that needed clearing. Some days more if the rock fractured well. Calla hauled muck. She built a simple wooden track from the salvaged timber, 2 planks laid on the floor of the bore so the wheelbarrow ran smooth instead of fighting the uneven rock, and she developed a rhythm that was almost mechanical. Fill, wheel, dump, come back empty, fill again. She never complained, and she never stopped unless Ruth told her to take water. I watched Ruth learn things that summer. I watched her figure out entirely on her own that if you wet the rock face before drilling, the holes held better. I watched her work out the right fuse length by cutting a test piece and timing it against her heartbeat. She had no watch. I had a watch, but she didn't trust it, she said, by which I understood, slower or faster depending on the man, and she timed it herself. I watched her adapt. There was a morning in the 2nd month when the bore crossed a layer of fractured schist, crumbly rock that tended to fall from the ceiling, and I came in the morning to find Ruth had already timbered the worst section with props she'd made herself, 3 new uprights and a collar beam, all fitted tight. She hadn't waited. She'd seen the problem and fixed it. I stood and looked at that work for a moment. Then I found her outside at the cook stove, and I wrote, the timbering in the bore. She looked up from the coffee and wrote, I saw the crack last night. I wrote, that is expert work. She read it. She looked at me with that still, assessing quality she had, and then she wrote more slowly than usual, as if she was picking the words. My father was a miner, before he got sick. I wrote, I didn't know that. She wrote, there is a lot you don't know. I wrote, tell me some of it. She looked at that for a moment. Then she half smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her, small and on one side of her mouth, and she wrote, maybe later. She handed me a cup of coffee. It was good coffee. She'd figured out I liked it strong, and she made it that way every morning without being asked. July was hot. The Calico Hills in July are about as close to the surface of the sun as I care to get. The rock in the bore held heat from the previous day's work and released it slow, so the first hour of the morning shift was bearable and the last hour was difficult, and we took to starting before first light to use the cool. We ate together every evening, the 3 of us. Ruth cooked most nights, Calla sometimes. I'd cook on Sundays. The day we didn't drill, I make a decent bean soup with salt pork and dried chili peppers, and a passable sourdough if I started the night before. After supper, we'd sit by the fire outside if it wasn't too hot, or at the table in the lean-to if it was. I learned more of the hand talk. Ruth taught me some of it deliberately, the most useful signs: water, fire, deer, rock, blow, yes, no, wait, come here, careful. Calla taught me signs I didn't ask for, ones she seemed to think I needed. She taught me the sign for stubborn, which was 2 fists bumped together, and aimed it at me with a grin the first time I used it wrongly and then insisted on doing the thing myself anyway. I started to get a feel for the rhythm of their communication. Ruth spoke in long thoughts, considered even in signs. Calla spoke in bursts and often interrupted herself to add something she'd thought of. They argued sometimes, fast and emphatic, and then one of them would laugh and it was over. They didn't hold things. I am by nature a man who holds things. I hold grievances. I hold mistakes I made 30 years ago. I hold the way Clara looked the morning I found her too sick to stand, and I have held that for 30 years without putting it down. Watching Ruth and Calla argue and then let it go, just open the hands and let it go, was something I watched with something I cannot entirely name. Not envy, more like admiration for a skill I'd never developed. One evening in July, Calla was asleep early. She'd had a long day, had gone 8 miles round trip for a deer that had led her a chase. And Ruth and I sat at the table with the lantern between us, and I wrote her a question I'd been carrying for a while. I wrote, "Your father was a miner, but you can do this work. Where did you learn the rest of it? The building, the spring, the garden." She wrote, "Mother, she knew how to make things last. Father pulled things out of the ground, Mother made sure they didn't disappear." I wrote, "Where is S.H.E.?" Ruth wrote, "Died when I was 16, fever." I wrote, "I'm sorry." She wrote, "How did you learn to be alone so long?" I looked at that, then I wrote, "Practice." She wrote, "That is not an answer." I wrote, "No, and my wife died when we were young, 30 years ago. After that I just kept moving and never stopped." She read it. She looked at me for a moment with that level, unguarded quality she had in quiet moments, when the assessing look was off and just the person was there. Then she wrote, "That is a long time to keep moving." I wrote, "It is." She wrote, "Did you ever want to stop?" I thought about that for a while before I wrote. I didn't know where to stop. She looked at the lantern for a moment. Then she wrote, not looking at me, "I think maybe this is a place someone could stop." I read that. I read it again. Then I put the pencil down and I just sat there, and the lantern guttered a little in a draft from the shaft door, and the coals in the stove ticked, and I thought, well. I did not write anything back. I didn't know what to write. I put the pencil down and I sat there, and after a moment she picked up her mending and started working at it, and that was the evening. I lay awake for a long time in the lean-to. In August, the powder shipment came up from Bisbee on the freight wagon, and we had enough to push hard. I bought 2 more boxes of hand steels and a second single jack so we could run 2 holes at once, Ruth on one and me on the other. This was faster, but it required absolute trust in timing. You had to know where the other person's steel was, had to keep the angle clean, had to blast on account that both people were committed to. We developed a rhythm of it. She'd signal with 2 knocks on the floor when her holes were loaded and fused. I'd signal back with 1 knock for ready. Then we'd light and move together without rushing and without running. Because you do not run in a mine bore, you walk fast with your head down. We never had a misfire. We never had a bad blast. I want to say that was luck, and partly it was. But it was also that Ruth was careful in the exact places where carelessness kills you. By the middle of August, we had advanced 100 feet from the syndicate's endpoint, 20 to 30 feet to go. One evening she wrote, "We are close." I wrote, "Yes." She wrote, "What happens if there is no silver?" I wrote, "We still have the water. Good spring garden coming in. The property is worth more than 9 cents. She wrote, "And if there is silver?" I wrote, "Then we have a mine." She wrote, "We." I hadn't noticed I'd written it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I wrote, "If you want." She wrote, "I want." We hit the main shaft on August 23rd. I know the date because I wrote it on the wall of the drainage bore with a piece of chalk. August 23, 1903, W. Creed, RGARZAC. GARZA, and we stood there in the dark with the lantern and looked at the black water we could see through the break in the wall, maybe 8 feet down. And then the water started to move. It was slow at first, just a pulling, a current going toward the new opening, then faster. You could hear it, a low chuckle of moving water, then a steady rush. Calla was standing behind us, and she put both hands on my shoulder and Ruth's shoulder at the same time, and we stood there and felt the mine begin to drain. I looked at Ruth. She was looking at the water. The lamplight moved on her face. She had chalk dust in her hair from the last drilling session and a scrape on her forearm from where a piece of falling rock had caught her 2 days before, and her eyes were bright. Not wet, just bright. The way a person looks when something they worked toward is actually happening. She put her hand on the rock wall next to where I'd written our names. She spread her fingers flat on the stone. I put my hand next to hers. The water ran past our feet in the dark. It took 6 weeks for the main shaft to drain fully, and another 2 weeks before the floor was solid enough to walk on without sinking. We used that time well. I reinforced the drainage bore timbering, extended the garden before the first frost came, and spent 2 weeks building a proper structure. A real building, not a lean-to, with a plank floor and a real chimney and a loft for storage, against the east face of the hill, joining it to the shaft entry. It wasn't a house exactly. But it was something. Ruth drew the plans. She drew them on a piece of brown paper with a rule and a compass she had in her gear. I don't know where she'd gotten a compass. She shrugged when I asked, which seemed to mean she'd had it a long time. She drew an elevation, a floor plan, and a detail of the roof pitch, and she handed them to me without comment. I looked at the drawings for a while. I said out loud, though I couldn't help it, "This is a good house." She wrote, "It is not a house yet." I wrote, "It will be." We built it in 2 weeks, working into the evenings with lanterns. Calla built the door. She had a better hand for fine joinery than either of us. It turned out, careful and patient, and hung it on iron hinges I'd gotten in the junction. It opened and closed smoothly, no drag. She looked at it swinging and gave it one small, pleased nod. The first frost came on October 3rd. We were inside when it did. October 9th, I took a lantern into the main shaft for the first time. The floor was damp but solid. The timber framing the syndicate had left was still largely sound. That was good hardwood, Douglas fir from the Oregon trade, and it had been dry before the flood and dry again now, and it had kept. The seam was visible on the east wall from just inside the portal, a stripe of quartz-heavy rock 4 inches wide that ran the whole visible length of the shaft at about shoulder height. I broke off a piece with my pick hammer. I held it up in the lantern light. The silver wasn't visible to the eye in its raw form. That's the thing people don't know. Silver ore doesn't look like what you'd imagine. It looks like dark, heavy rock with a dull luster to it, sometimes a little brightness in the fresh break. But I'd been around enough assay results to know what I was looking at, and I cut a second piece from the seam deeper in and weighed it in my hand. Heavy, heavier than the surrounding rock by a good margin. I went back outside. Ruth was at the cook stove. I handed her the piece of ore. She weighed it in her hand the same way I had. She looked at it in the sunlight. She wrote, "Is it good?" I wrote, "We will need an assay to be sure, but I think it is good." She held the rock in her hand and looked at it for a long time. Then she walked to the edge of the hillside and looked out over the valley below, the long sweep of the desert floor, the brown grass, the far blue line of the mountains. Calla came and stood next to her, and Ruth passed her the rock without a word, and Calla looked at it and then looked out at the same view. Then they looked at each other, the hand-talk going fast, and they laughed. Real laughter, both of them, faces open. I don't know what they said, but I watched it and I thought, whatever they're saying, that's right. That's the right thing to be saying right now. I stayed where I was by the shaft entry, and I let them have it. I want to say here what kind of man I was by October of 1903, because I think it's relevant. I was a man who had lived 57 years without being particularly necessary to anyone. That is not self-pity, it is just accurate. The people I'd worked alongside over the years had used my labor and moved on. I'd used theirs. Bauer at the Rafter Tea needed me for 30 days, and I needed his $30, and we got exactly what we both needed, and no more. My marriage to Clara had been real. I don't want to suggest otherwise. But it had been 30 years ago, and it had been 2 years long, and then it was gone, and I'd spent 30 years afterward being a man who moved and did not stop. Being needed for something is different. Ruth and Calla needed what I brought to this property. Not as a rescuer, I want to be precise about this. They had survived fine without me for 14 months. What I had was resources they didn't. Money for tools, strength for the single jack, knowledge of powder work. What they had was everything else. The knowledge of the property, the built-in systems, the skills, the judgment. We were not benefactor and recipients. We were people with different halves of a thing, and together the thing worked. But there is something about being the person who swings the jack on a seam that turns out to have silver in it. Something about walking down to the junction and filing an amended claim with your name and 2 others on it. I did that in October, Ruth Garza and Calla Garza listed as co-owners, 1/3 share each, and having the clerk look up and say, "You're serious about this mine?" and saying, "Yes. Yes, I am." There is something about being serious about something, after 57 years of keeping moving. I had not known I was waiting for it. I don't know if waiting is the right word. I had not known there was a version of my life where I stopped, and the stopping was by choice, and what I stopped at was worth stopping at. I had carried a picture in my head, not quite a picture, more a feeling, a shape of a life, in which I ended up alone in a bunk somewhere, which is what happens to men who don't stop. I had accepted that picture as the likely truth. I had not accounted for a 9-cent mine in the Calico Hills, and 2 women who already knew how to live in it. The assay came back in November. A man named Pruitt ran the assay office in Calico Junction, old man, had been doing assays in the Silver District since the 70s, had a nose for ore that was beyond what any chemical test could give you. He weighed the samples, ran his acid tests, worked through his arithmetic in a ledger, and then he looked up at me and said, "Mr. Creed, the Hennessy seam is running 61 ounces per ton on this sample." I said, "What was it when they shut down in 91? He looked at his records. He said, 40 ounces. I sat with that. He said, "The seam widened at depth just like they thought. You've got a richer ore body below the old workings. I would estimate, and this is estimation, not a warranty, that you are sitting on a commercial ore deposit. Modest, not a bonanza, but workable, very workable." I said, "How long?" He said, "Depends how hard you work it. 10 years, maybe more if the widening continues." I said, "What would it take to put it in production?" "Properly." He thought about it. He said, "Stamp mill eventually, but not right away. For hand sorting and rough concentration, you could start paying ore in the spring with what you've got. You'd want to hire 2 or 3 men for the ore handling and get a mule-drawn Arastra going for the initial concentration. Say, $600 or $800 to get started properly. I know a man in Bisbee who runs a custom concentrator. He'll process your ore for 20% of the return until you have your own equipment." I went back to the mine and told Ruth, not all of it at once. I wrote, "The assay is good. The seam is richer than the old owners knew. We can work it." She read it 3 times. Then she wrote how much. I wrote 61 ounces per ton. It was 40 when they quit. She sat very still for a moment. Then she wrote, "Tell me what we need." I told her. She made notes on her brown paper. Her handwriting was neat even when she was writing fast. She did some arithmetic in the margin. She was quick with figures, always had been faster than me. She looked up and wrote, "If we work 2 shifts a week through winter pulling selected ore and stockpile it, we could have enough for a first shipment by spring without hiring anyone yet." I hadn't thought of that. I wrote, "You want to start before spring." She wrote, "I want to start now." Calla, who'd been reading over Ruth's shoulder, she did that, signed something rapid at Ruth, who signed back. Calla grinned and signed again. Ruth rolled her eyes in the universal way of older sisters and wrote on her board, holding it toward me. She says, "You have a good face when things go the way they should." I looked at that for a moment. Then I looked at Calla, who was watching me with a grin that said she knew exactly what was on the board. I made the sign she'd taught me, 2 fists bumped together. Stubborn. She threw her head back and laughed. We worked through November and into December, pulling selected ore from the richest section of the seam, the stuff that would assay above 50 ounces, which Pruitt had told me to look for by weight and luster, and stockpiling it near the shaft entry. It was cold, and it was hard, and it was good. I want to say something about the cold, actually. The Calico Hills in December are not something to take lightly. The wind off the high desert is different from a summer wind. It comes at you with intent, gets under the collar, finds the gap between your glove and your sleeve. You lose fingers if you're not paying attention, or you don't, but either way the cold is the condition and you work in it or you don't work. We worked in it. Ruth rigged a canvas shelter over the shaft entry to break the wind. I built a windbreak on the north side of the property from stacked stone and salvage lumber. Calla, who seemed impervious to cold, She'd been up here through the previous winter, and apparently just absorbed it as a fact. Kept the cook stove going without discussion. Always had hot coffee ready when you came out of the shaft. Always had something heating for the midday meal. One evening in early December, I came out of the shaft to find Ruth sitting on the stone step outside the door to the building we'd made, looking out at the valley. The sun was going down, and the sky to the west was a color I don't have a name for, not red, not orange, something that lasted about 3 minutes and made the whole landscape look like it was made of copper. She had her knees drawn up and her coffee cup in both hands. I sat down next to her. We sat there for a while. She didn't write anything, and I didn't say anything, and we watched the sky change. After the copper color faded, she turned and wrote. When Kala and I came up here, we thought we were hiding. I waited. She wrote, we thought we would stay for a few months and then find something else. There was never a plan. We just could not think of anywhere to go. I wrote, and now. She wrote, now I know where I am. I looked at that. I wrote, so do I. She looked at me then, the straight, clear look she gave things she was deciding about. Then she turned back to the valley and we sat there for a while more, and then the cold drove us inside. But she had moved when we went in, so that her shoulder touched mine going through the door, and she didn't move away after. I want to skip some of the middle of that winter, not because it wasn't real, but because some things are private, and I've already said more than I usually say, and I'm not a man who does well with explaining certain things. I'll just say that by January of 1904, the arrangement between Ruth and me had shifted in a way that was unmistakable, and had been coming since approximately the evening in July when she'd written. I think maybe this is a place someone could stop. I want to say one thing about it, though, because it matters. It was Ruth's doing. I was not capable of it, I think. I had been a man who moved for 30 years, and the moving had become a kind of identity, a way of not being hurt again, if I'm honest, though I didn't use those words then. I could have been on that property for 5 years and treated it as a stopping place and still not committed to it in my own mind, because that is the kind of fool a man can become when he's been running long enough. What Ruth did not in a single moment, not dramatically, was she was just steady. She was there. She was the same person from one day to the next, direct, capable, good, asking nothing she didn't also give. And gradually, the way you stop noticing a stone in your boot after you've been walking with it long enough, I stopped noticing that I was waiting to leave. I stopped making the calculation. I stopped hearing the internal voice that said, don't stay too long. One evening I was sitting at the table working on the figures for the spring ore shipment. We were going to have enough for a first run. It was looking real, and Ruth was at the other end of the table working on something of her own, her hands moving over the paper, and I looked up and she was looking at me. Just looking at me. With this expression that was not complicated at all, which is what made it land the way it did. It was the look of a person who is glad the other person is there. I put the pencil down. She wrote what? I wrote nothing, just looking. She wrote in those looping capital letters, then look. I looked, she looked back at me, level and unashamed, and then she went back to her work. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. And I want you to understand what it meant to a man who had been invisible for 30 years to have a good woman look at him that way. Spring. The first ore shipment went down to the junction on a Thursday in March on a wagon I rented from Holly's brother, who had also figured out by then that the Hennessy might be real and was very cheerful about letting me use his equipment. I drove. Ruth rode on the seat next to me. Kala rode Amos behind. The stockpile weighed out at 11 tons of selected ore. At 61 ounces per ton and the going silver price that March, that was roughly $4,300 before the concentrator took his cut. I want to say that number again, $4,300. In the winter of 1903, I had $2 in my pocket. The mine was worth 9 cents. Pruitt weighed the load himself. He ran a spot assay on a few samples to confirm the grade, and when the numbers came back, he looked up at Ruth and me and said, "You drilled that drainage bore yourselves?" I said we did. He looked at Ruth. He said, "You worked the rock." Ruth was reading his lips. She nodded. Pruitt looked at me. He said, "Most men would have hired a crew." I said, "She's better on the steels than anyone I'd have hired." Ruth heard that. I said it slow and clear, and she kept her face neutral, but I saw the line of her jaw ease just slightly. Not pride exactly, more like recognized. That is the word, she was recognized. Pruitt wrote the figure on a slip, the net amount after his cut, and slid it across to me. I picked it up, looked at it, and handed it to Ruth. She read it again. Then she turned to Calla and signed, and Calla's face did something that started as trying to stay calm and ended as not being able to, and she covered her mouth with both hands and her shoulders shook. I looked at the number again. Then I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. We had a good dinner in the Junction that evening at the hotel dining room. Prewitt joined us. Hollies from the recorder's office came by and shook my hand and said she'd always thought someone smart would do something with the Hennessy. I let that stand. Calla had the roast chicken. She ate with great satisfaction. The summer of 1904, we put the mine properly into production. I hired 3 men, carefully, taking my time, going by recommendation from Bauer at the Rafter T, who knew the labor supply in the district. I hired a good driller, a young Mexican man named Santos who'd been working the copper mines in Bisbee and had been laid off when the price dropped. I hired an ore handler named Pete Dolan, a big quiet man from Montana who was thorough and didn't complain, and I hired a mulescaneer named Webb for the hauling. I ran the crew. Ruth managed the books, the ordering of supplies, the correspondence with the concentrator in Bisbee, and the business side of things generally. Calla continued to hunt to maintain the property, and this was new. She had taken to teaching Santos and Dolan the hand signs for mine work, the basic vocabulary of ready, clear, light the fuse, coming out, get back. It saved time. It also meant that when Dolan had a question and I wasn't in the shaft, he could ask Ruth or Calla directly and get an answer, which was efficient and which mattered to Ruth in a way I understood. She had been treated, I think, in many places before this as a woman who could not be communicated with because of the deafness, because of the assumption that if she could not hear you, she could not understand you. She was more intelligent than anyone else I knew, and she had been working around that assumption all her life. On our mind, she was the person whose opinion settled things. I made that clear early, and I kept it clear. When Santos had a question about the seam's angle, she was the one who answered it because she'd spent more time reading that seam than anyone. When Webb had a question about the road and whether the wagon needed a different team, she walked the road and assessed it and said, wrote to me, who then relayed it. Yes, heavier team, the pitch is steeper than the grade suggests. She was right. The men figured it out by midsummer, not all at once. But Santos was smart, and he watched and he learned, and by August he was bringing questions directly to Ruth with gestures and a piece of chalk, and she was answering him directly, and that was the way of it. In the fall of 1904, Calla brought a man up to the property. He had come through the valley below, and she'd found him at the spring, which was on the edge of the property but not fenced, and she'd given him water because she was that kind of person, and then she'd let him up. He was a young man, 20-something, came from Sonora, spoke no English, had a saddle horse that was lame on the near front. I looked at the horse's foot. There was a stone wedged deep between the frog and the shoe, badly set. I got it out, checked for damage, packed the frog with pine tar and clean cloth, and loosened the shoe to give the foot room. The horse was going to be fine in a few days. The young man, his name was Hector, watched me do this. When I was done, he said something in Spanish that I did not understand, and Calla signed to Ruth, who wrote. He says his father taught him that a man who heals an animal can be trusted. I wrote back, tell him his father was right. Hector stayed 3 days while the horse healed. He helped with the ore hauling. He and Calla communicated in a way I could not account for at first. She didn't speak, he didn't sign, and then I realized they were writing back and forth on pieces of rock dust on the flat stones near the shaft entry, drawing pictures when the words didn't work. I watched this and I thought, well, people find ways. He left on the 4th day. He looked back twice going down the wagon road. Ruth and I watched him go, and then looked at each other. I wrote that might happen again. She wrote probably. I wrote that would be all right. She looked at me with one of those direct looks. Then she wrote, yes, it would. There is one moment I want to get exactly right, and I'm going to try. November of 1904. The mine was in its 2nd good season, the crew was squared away, the ore was moving. One evening after the crew had gone down to their bunks, I'd built 2 bunkhouses by then, one for the men, one we used for storage. Ruth and I were in the building we'd made, the real one with the plank floor and the loft. It was cold. The stove was going. Calla was asleep in the shaft, where she still preferred to sleep. Ruth was going over the accounts. She had a good head for the arithmetic, but more than that she had a good head for the pattern of money. She could see where it was going to pile up, and where it was going to get thin 6 months before it happened. I had come to rely on her reading of those numbers entirely. She'd been right 3 times already about something I'd thought was fine that wasn't. I was sharpening tools at the other end of the table. The scraping of the whetstone, the tick of the stove, no other sound. She put her pencil down. She looked at the ledger for a moment, then she looked at me. She wrote, "I want to tell you something." I put the whetstone down. She wrote, "When Calla and I came to the Calicos, we thought we were nothing. We had nothing and we were nothing and we were going to stay nothing." I started to write something, but she held up a hand. "Wait." She wrote, "I am not saying this so you feel sorry for me. I am saying it so you know what you changed." I sat with that. She wrote, "You bought a mine that nobody wanted, and you drove the first nail before you had a plan, and you saw what we built, and you said good. You said good and you worked beside us, and you never once made me feel like I was the problem to be solved." She stopped, she looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote below it in smaller letters, "Most men make you feel like the problem to be solved, even the good ONES." I sat for a long time, then I wrote, "I didn't know what I was doing. I was making it up from one day to the next." She wrote, "I know, that is why it worked." I looked at her. She was looking at me steadily, the way she had that evening in the copper light, no agenda in it, no performance. Just a person looking at another person and meaning what she said. I am not a man who moves toward things easily. I have told you that. I kept still for 30 years after Clara because keeping still felt like the safer thing, and also because I had made a practice of it for so long that it had become the habit of my life, the reflexive move when things got complicated. I got up from the table. I went to her side of the table. I put my hand on her shoulder, careful, not pushing, just there. She reached up and put her hand over mine. She didn't look up. She just held my hand on her shoulder, her fingers over my knuckles. And we stayed like that for a while with the stove going and the cold outside and the mine at our backs and everything we had built between us present in that room. Then she looked up at me, just up, and the expression on her face was a simple one, though it is one I had not seen directed at me for 30 years and did not know I had been missing until it was there. She was glad I was there. She was glad it was me. I put my other hand against the side of her face, rough old hand, not a gentle hand, and she leaned into it just slightly, like a person who has been carrying weight for a long time and is deciding it is allowed to set it down. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. I will tell you how things ended up, because it is your right to know, and because the ending is real. In the spring of 1905, we filed an amended deed with the county making the property a legal partnership. Hollies in the recorder's office stamped it without a word, which was all the acknowledgement I needed. The mine ran for 11 years, which was exactly what Prewitt had estimated. Not a bonanza. A workable deposit steadily worked. By 1907, we had a proper arrastra running, and by 1909, we had a small stamp mill of our own. The crew grew to 6 men at the peak, then back to 4 toward the end when the seam began to thin. In 1908, Calla married Hector, who had come back the spring after his first visit and asked Ruth, in writing, whether it would be all right with us. Ruth had written back, "It is not up to us. Ask Calla." He had looked at her, pointed at Calla, mimed, but how? Ruth had shown him 30 signs, basic ones, the vocabulary of the mine and the property. He learned them in 2 days. He and Calla built their own house on the south slope, a good stone house, and in 1910 they had a son. Hector was, I'll say it plain, a fine man. He learned more sign language over the years than I ever did. He and Calla raised that boy to sign, and English and Spanish, and by the time the boy was 7, he could translate between all 3 without blinking. Ruth and I lived in the building we'd made together, the one with the plank floor and the loft. We added to it over the years, a real kitchen, a porch on the east side where you could see the whole valley below. She kept the accounts until the mine closed, and after it closed, she kept the accounts for the property, which was by then worth considerably more than 9 cents. I am in my 70s now. The mine is played out, the shaft is quiet, the drainage bore we drilled that summer is still open and still does its work, carrying the small amount of groundwater out through the hill without buildup. The spring still runs at about a gallon a minute. The kitchen garden is Calla's now, bigger than it used to be. Ruth's hair is gray. She moves differently than she did when she was 35. There is a stiffness in her right shoulder from the rock work, from years of holding the steels, and on cold mornings I can see her working it loose before she comes to the table. She does not complain about it. She would not. I look at her and I see every version of her at once. The woman in the mine entry with the axe and the chalkboard, the woman in the drainage bore turning the steels, the woman at the table in November lamplight looking up at me. I see them all and they are all the same person, which is a thing I had forgotten was possible, that someone could be the same person across time, that you could rely on the consistency of them. I have been still for 20 years. I am still here. The mine is behind me and the valley is below, and Ruth is at the table with her coffee, and the accounts from the neighbor's cattle operation that she helps with now, because the neighbor is a young man who is good with cattle and bad with numbers, and he knew enough to ask. This morning she looked up when I came in from outside, and she looked at me the same way she looked at me that November night, glad I was there, glad it was me, and I thought, 57 years of moving, and this is where it led. This is where I stopped. A flooded mine worth 9 cents, 2 women who knew how to live in it. I bought a deed and I drove a nail and I did not have a plan. And somewhere in the space between those things and the drainage bore and the steels and the evenings at the table with the ledger and the lantern, something happened that I cannot fully account for. What I know is this: she looked at me and she saw what I was. She stayed when she had every reason to go. She built something real out of ground that everyone else had written off, and she let me be part of it. That is all a man ever wants. To be seen as what he is by someone worth being seen by, to have his work mean something, to stop moving because the place where he's stopped is worth the stopping. I picked up my coffee this morning and sat down across from her, and she wrote. The chalkboard is still there, still used, habit of decades, 2 words. She wrote, "Good morning." And I said, "Good morning, Ruth." And that was the day.